Thanks for joining me. I'm Robin Das, Executive Director of Go-to-Market Strategy at DataBee, and welcome to our webinar, Solving Your Vulnerability and Asset Exposure Management Challenges. And I'm thrilled to welcome two guests, Harriett Yeh, Director of Vulnerability Management and Product Security and Incident Response at Comcast, and Jill Cagliostro, Director of Product at DataBee. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having me. So, we're here to discuss a core security function, which is like vulnerability and asset exposure. If I was looking at the statistics, there are about 40,000 common exposed vulnerabilities or CVEs, an increase of about 38% year over year. And I think the seventh year in a row that it was increasing. Just sort of an open question for both of you. I mean, what's causing this growth in CVEs?
Yeah, I think initially, I think you can think at the consumer demands. We're needing to get products out the door quickly, right? So therefore, potentially there's not as much due diligence as there potentially was previously. Advancement in technology, and then also, potentially tools are better at detecting these vulnerabilities where they previously wouldn't have identified them.
Yeah, and to build upon that, the advancements in technologies, we really see software coming into everything we do, right? So the number of applications and software and apps that are out there, IoT, things to find vulnerabilities in is continuously growing. And so, in our continual growth towards innovation to adopt new technologies, that does create more risk, right?
Yeah, so the same old story is as the technology expands, the vulnerabilities and the security, the security follows right behind it. And so then, okay, we know that sort of the CVEs are expanding. I mean, sort of what's the impact to the enterprise if they kind of can't keep up with patching these vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I think that's not necessarily the option, right? There is no option to not keep up with vulnerabilities or CVs that get identified. Right. So it's how do we manage this, right? So, how many CVEs are identified, but how many are exploitable, or how many are actually affecting our tech stack? How many do we actually have that are potentially targeting critical assets, for example, or have lateral movement to critical assets? So I think we really have to understand our infrastructure. I know, working at a very complex, organization from technology stack and the scale is so vast, right? So, I can speak with kind of experience from having done it, that it is complex, but you have to kind of work with multiple teams within the organization to actually understand, okay, this is our risk, these are our vulnerabilities, and how can we chunk them up? You've got thousands, millions of vulnerabilities being identified, right, every day. But I think we have to look and go, okay, what is our SLA on X vulnerabilities? And I just think it's about chunking them up into manageable ways. I don't know if Jill, in terms of what you kind of think on it.
Yeah, I mean, the struggle is real. So if you look at the time to exploit from when a CVE is announced to when an adversary is likely to exploit it, it is decreasing. So that clock that we have on how quickly can you patch to reduce your risk is getting shorter and shorter, which creates a lot of pressure for our security teams. Cross-functionally, it really impacts the whole org, because where are these vulnerabilities sitting? On mission-critical business applications, which is how you end up missing things like SLAs. But, that's not always the end of the world. I mean, the fines may say differently depending on the situation. But the important thing is to balance the needs of the business with the needs of security. So taking that chunked approach, like Harriett was mentioning, can help you make those trade-offs a little more effectively, because you never want security to be a barrier for the business. And the fact that you have more vulnerabilities may not be a bad thing. Maybe that means your business is expanding into new areas and requires new technologies. So you've just stood up a whole new cloud infrastructure, for example. No one's going to do that perfectly secure on the first time. So yes, there's going to be some new things that pop up. But as long as you're supporting the needs of your business and responding to these risks as they're being identified and coming into your organization, you're on the right path. It's really a journey.
And so then how do you think security teams, I mean, it was an interesting point that you made about like these cross-functional teams, and you have to work with these cross-functional teams. So I can imagine that is sort of challenging sometimes within the realm of the person responsible for the vulnerabilities. But then, how have you found the security teams adapting to kind of handle, both this growth, and then to Jill, your point, like sometimes it's great growth because it means that the business is expanding and you're sort of increasing your software. But how are the security teams tasked with patching these vulnerabilities, sort of keeping up?
I think you need to look at what the vulnerabilities are. What requires, when vulnerabilities have been identified, what is, for example, an OS patch, or what is an application patch? Like, what potentially can be automated and what requires potentially a configuration change that an engineer needs to actually make that update or that change. So I think it requires huge communication. Like I firstly, I love that we're talking about vulnerability management and exposure management. There's not enough webinars that actually talk about specifically this. I think when we look at vulnerability management, we have to work with teams every day to ensure that they understand what their vulnerabilities are. Okay, yes, we are there to potentially assign vulnerabilities to teams, but that is not all we do, in terms of, and if anything, that isn't really what we do. We have to work with the team. Teams may not know how to remediate their vulnerabilities, so it's an educational piece in actually how you remediate. Teams might but just be so overwhelmed with the amount of vulnerabilities, they need to say, what do you want me to prioritize first? You might have critical, high, medium, low vulnerabilities, right? And within that critical, you may have exploited vulnerabilities, you may not have exploited vulnerabilities. So again, it's very much having that approach that we're here to support. I know security kind of like has a legacy kind of view of, they're blocking this or they're slowing down, but I really don't think that's the case, and I don't think that's how business looks at security these days. I really think that we're trying to help teams. We're trying to enable teams to say, like, what do you need from us to help you remediate these? Yes, they might own the risk, but we want them to remediate. We want to reduce our attack surface, right? So what do you need from us to work with you to get those critical risks remediated? And I think that engagement has been fantastic. Like, I've seen a change over the years that I've worked in VM, in vulnerability management, and I think that communication, and engagement has grown massively. And I think teams are overwhelmed and they need that, how do I prioritize? What do I need to look at?
Yeah, and Harriett has done a great job of taking those conversations from maybe more of a traditionally a little bit of a combative situation between teams to a completely collaborative one. And really, it comes down to not just enablement, but the way that Harriett is able to accomplish this enablement is through sharing data, right? And not just throwing all the data at someone, but helping them understand what data they're looking at, how it's relevant, and taking more of a focused approach to working collaboratively, cross-functionally to deal with the problems at hand. And being really focused on solutions instead of problems, right? You may have 1,000 vulnerabilities on a host, but if they're all resolved by one software upgrade, you really have one risk, even though it's counted 1,000 times. And so when you start to take, a more data-driven approach to how you're tackling your CVE problem, it can be a little bit less overwhelming, and it allows these conversations to be more focused on solving the problem, right? As opposed to where did this problem come from?
So there was a lot to unpack. There's some like really interesting points that I think that you made. And so, sort of going back to this, like how teams or how vulnerability teams are shifting to sort of handle this growing set of vulnerabilities. Like it sounds like it's less focusing on owners. It's less like that sort of busy work of just kind of like identifying owners and like going and beating those owners over the head. It's a lot more around the idea of like, how do you work with those teams? And so is there sort of a tension there? Because like there's going to be a bunch of in the weeds work to kind of just do the basic blocking and tackling. Like who owns this? You were talking about OS versus application. And so I think, in complex enterprises, like the person that owns the OS is not necessarily the same person that owns the applications, which is not necessarily the same person that owns the assets. And so, it seems like there's an environment where there's like a lot of basic sort of in the weeds work needs to be done. But then for what you were sort of saying about like, well, how do we help you solve that? It also sounds like there's a lot of like this kind of higher level, more collaborative work. And so like, how do you think about that inherent tension there?
Yeah, so I mean, VM is relentless.
Right.
Every day you have to roll up your sleeves and get involved with the data. As you say, new vulnerabilities are coming up. Nation states CVEs are appearing that you have to focus on. So it's it's nonstop, and there's multiple layers of how you get vulnerabilities remediated. Like, of course, you have kind of your procedures and how you do this, but it's deeper than that, and it's more complex than that in terms of, so for example, if we're scanning on our perimeter, which is externally facing IP addresses, right, you're going to have a number of IPs that are not associated to an owner, but we, from the VM perspective, we need to get that vulnerability that's been identified fixed as quickly as possible. And yes, we have SLAs, and yes, it's the business units team to fix those vulnerabilities within SLA, but it very much affects or reflects on our vulnerability management program. So how do we tackle that? If we've got a 30-day or 40-day or a 7-day SLA, for example, we need to make sure that we know who the owner is within that time frame. So what do we do, right? So there's multiple like sources that you can investigate. There's multiple tools that you can utilize. How you identify that, it takes time. So actually, if you look from the CVE being identified to the time remediated, that could be days. And if you think that that's a window open for an attacker to potentially exploit that vulnerability, one thing that I would say is like I said, it's not for the faint-hearted to be in VM. You just have to constantly investigate. But the one thing that you need to do when you investigate and you identify the owner, you need to then work with the asset management team, GRC, to make sure you're fixing the source data. And I think that's where we need to make sure we close the gap or close the loop on that connection. All of that work that we've taken investigation to identify the owner, if we're not then getting it added to our CMDB, we're going to experience this again, right? So
Right.
we need to make sure that we've spent X hours, and you should quantify this. All of this is massive metrics, showing, from a CISO perspective, they just want to see you've identified that many vulnerabilities. So one of the things they want to identify is you've identified X vulnerabilities and they've been remediated in SLA. They are not necessarily so focused on how many hours did it take you to identify that owner, but they expect you to then add that information into the source data. And that's huge. And I think that is time consuming. That it's time consuming to actually catch up with the asset management team, work with GRC to make sure they've then got accountability to the standards and policy. But you have to close that gap, because otherwise you're not turning off the tap. You're doing all this work, but it's still pouring in, right? So
Right.
you need to get to a stage, and it is relentless. And it may not even be in your time that you stay in the company, but the next person that follows you is going to go, brilliant, our CMDB is updated because of X person who was here. Thankfully they actually, spent the time to work with the asset team to actually update that source data. That is huge, that link back to CMDB.
Not all heroes wear capes.
It's so
Well,
true. Most of them work in IT and chase down asset owners because, like Harriet just mentioned, inventory is really the core struggle at a lot of different IT and security problems, but including vulnerability management, right? And it's not just the CMDB. You may have multiple sources of truth for your organization depending on the kind of information you're tracking. Like all of your applications, they're not usually tracked in the same tool as all of your devices, right? But we need to be able to cross-correlate these data sets and understand where those gaps are. And so we at DataBee try to make that a little easier. We actually automate all of that for you. So we'll bring in all of your different CMDB data sources, your asset list, that random Excel file that you manage in SharePoint, right? pull that all in and normalize it into OCSF, which is a vendor agnostic logging standard. So that way it doesn't matter what vendor you have. Serial number means the serial number on the computer, no matter which source you're looking at, right? And once you have all the data coming in, brought together and automatically merged and collisions handled for you, that's when you can start to find those gaps, like all those unowned assets from the team that stood up that server to meet that business deadline, which is great, go team, but like nobody went back and updated the CMDB. And so DataBee can actually not only identify these devices and keep track of what it learned about it, but it'll take it a step further and suggest owners based on things like not only who used the device, but based on names with their devices with similar names that also have owners. Because realistically, what's in a name for an organization for a host? Quite a lot. Usually a production designation, a site code, application, and then that random identifier. So if, person X owns all of the devices in a certain category, they probably own that new one that popped up too that nobody registered. And so this helps to, by starting to normalize and consolidate this data, it makes it a little bit easier when that next vulnerability comes in and you need to respond quickly.
So it's that, if I'm sort of thinking about this correctly, it's almost like that proactive sort of updating of the CMDB or the systems of record that mean when sort of, folks like Harriett have sort of vulnerabilities they need to patch, like they have the answers there ready to go, sort of at their fingertips. And so if I think about how that meaningfully impacts the SLA, it means we're not spending, a couple of days, we were talking about that closing window. We're not spending a couple of days sort of running around trying to find the owner. We can actually be spending those days that we have to kind of close that window. That totally makes sense. Like, I mean, are there any other sort of, well, actually, are there any other kind of key strategies that I think we see sort of in the industry that kind of help with the SLAs and the closure rates and the vulnerability management?
So there's a few things, right? One is when you think about going back to what Harriet was mentioning earlier around prioritization. It's not just about your asset criticality, but it can also bring in threat intelligence. Harriet also mentioned nation state actors tend to exploit certain vulnerabilities. And if you know that you are in a target industry for that group, you probably want to patch those first, right? And so there's a couple of different things that can get brought into the CVSS score is the most commonly talked about, but that flat number isn't the most informative in terms of impact to your business. There is a matrix behind it that tells you things like, do you need physical access to exploit it? Because odds are someone's not breaking into your data center. You could probably wait on that one, right? Is authentication required? If not, okay, probably want to prioritize that one, a little scarier, right? And, Harriet, I know there's some sources you are interested in too for that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that triage of risk is huge. One thing I actually wanted to touch upon that we were speaking about earlier, I think Jill, you mentioned it around scanning and the numbers of vulnerabilities that had increased, right? And I just wanted to go back to it because, when teams are VM teams, there's kind of three ways of scanning, right? From a network based, or you got the unauthenticated scan, you got the authenticated scan, you got the agent based. So when you go from an unauthenticated scan to an authenticated scan or an agent, those numbers of vulnerabilities jump up dramatically. And I just wanted to flag that, as a Jill, I think you mentioned, that's not a bad thing. You now have coverage of an area where you didn't have coverage before. So I think about, when people are, potentially running a VM program, and when I was in kind of like early stages, people go, oh, we don't want to auth scan there because the vulnerabilities. We go, no. We need to just educate, our leaders of why we do want to authenticate scan. We want to see those number of vulnerabilities go up because then we know about them. We know where we've got gaps. We know where we're vulnerable. So, the VONs are going to go up, but our coverage has gone up. So that was fantastic. I just wanted to bring that back though to highlight actually authenticated scanning or agent-based scanning is more comprehensive. That is what we want. You kind of want the two-prong from an unauthenticated view, a remote attacker, and then you want a authenticated view from a privileged authenticated attacker perspective. You want those two you want that two-step scanning. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight that, because that's, people think, oh, vulnerability is bad, but actually vulnerability is good, because we now have coverage over that, and we can then chunk them up within our kind of remediation efforts.
And so interesting though, sort of to push back on something though, one of the things, I'd love to kind of dwell on is like, the vulnerabilities are going up. Does that mean sort of the volumes of data that you're having to kind of think about are also going up? And I think, we sort of painted this, straightforward picture of like, if we have more data, we can make better decisions. Like what are some of the challenges that the enterprises face, sort of almost with that sort of counter effect? Like we're getting better coverage, but now we've got like more data to kind of think about. We've got more of a rubric to kind of analyze. Like, what are some of those challenges?
I think, again, it goes back, and I think maybe Jill mentioned it as well, in terms of slicing and dicing the data of actually what is the CVE? Like, is it being actively exploited? Is it a nation state? Does it require privileged admin, etc.? Is it a remote code execution? Like, is there a proof of concept? Like, I think all of that is layered. You kind of need to look, and we have tools, we have like tools that can do this, right? It's not one person looking at this data having to do that chunk by chunk. The tools now are smart enough to do this, but it does require, and I know like one of the things that we'll probably mention is AI, utilizing that AI side of things into this. I think not jumping on, Robin, your next question or anything, but when we think about AI, right, you might think how automation is automation. AI is different from automation, right? It's being able to move your engineer away from doing something because AI is smart enough to do it. But that allows the engineer to do something much smarter that actually requires, and probably more interesting than what they were previously doing, right? So it's a balance there on that. But it's non-stop. It's non-stop. I think there's layers of like, okay, we've got 1,000 vulnerabilities. What do we target first? It goes back to priority. Like, it will always go back to priority. And if you've got vulnerabilities in one area of your network, it's not isolated, there's no ACLs in place, or it's exposed on the perimeter, like that's going to be more of a priority, right? And it does just go back to triage and priority for me anyway.
It sounds like you need, with all this data, to your point, it's not somebody by themselves. You do need tools. You do need help to kind of help sort of manage this, whether it's a rubric or to kind of just help the engineer sort of, the AI does the basic stuff, and then the engineer can kind of do the higher level stuff. Like, is that sort of an accurate comment?
Yeah, I mean, Jill, sorry, like you're going to say something.
Yeah, no, it's just, if you think about it, right, to go back to the original question of the scaling problem, like, as you get more vulnerabilities, it becomes harder to get these insights of knowing who might own this device. When you're talking about, 1,000 or 10,000 devices, you might have the naming convention memorized. But when you add in an entire another region and that number triples or grows by another order of magnitude, now we're talking a different ballgame, right? And then when you have, even 5% of those assets unowned, and you're talking like thousands of people, you'd have to go say, hey, do you own this to? Or send the email and hope they reply. But we all know how well that goes in today's day and age, right? And so where I see AI in the future bringing the most value to be able to offer automation around some of those more tedious tasks, if you will, busy work, if you will, something like our DataBee Beekeeper, which allows an automated chatbot that will proactively reach out to the potential owners of applications or devices and say, hey, we see you've interacted with this, do you own it? And to take it a step further, it'll take your employees' institutional knowledge and put it to work, because it'll ask them, okay, you don't own this, but do you know who does? And it'll take that feedback and reach out to that person next. So rather than wasting, a security person's an entire job really is just hunting down these owners, you can now take that person and have them focused on gaining insights from your data, looking for gaps that something like Beekeeper can automate away.
That is a great feature, by the way. I know you gave me a quick demo of it, which I was quite fortunate to see. But I mean, from an end user perspective, also, if something doesn't belong to me, I don't want it assigned to me. I
Right.
don't want something in my queue that I'm not responsible for. I get the pain point of the business units. For us, we're assigning it to you because whatever data has said that you fix it. But if it's not you, the beekeeper, is there, you can add whatever you need to it, and then potentially, it can link or update the source data. So therefore we don't get that same issue again. So no, I think it's a great capability.
Yeah, making it a little bit easier to keep your source of truth truthful.
Well, because it sounds like I mean, obviously, number one, this wouldn't be a business discussion in the year 2025 without mentioning AI. So I'm glad we've kind of knocked that one off our bingo card. But it does sound like a really fun, well, not fun for the AI, but like it sounds like, it's a repetitive task that can be done at scale, that can sort of take inputs. It seems like a really interesting sort of use case for AI and AI chatbots in general.
And if you think about it, it's not just, I mean, obviously there's the huge time savings, which is significant, but it's also having that owner now when you need it, right? If you are running manual campaigns of emails or someone going out and asking all these questions, odds are you're not doing this based on newly discovered orphaned assets that were just picked up today. By bringing this into how you maintain your asset inventory and automating it, it's closing those gaps. When you find the next vulnerability, your first step isn't find the owner. That's already handled for you. You get to jump right to let's solve the problem.
And
I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say what a great feature would be able to also pull a metric on that in terms of from a
Right.
report, like how many were assigned incorrectly, and then the end user actually helped. That would be good from a leader perspective to say, oh, okay, our CMDB wasn't populated by X number, and you can actually see the progression. Hopefully not regression, but on that.
Yeah, and that's great. And so we basically can help. Like you were saying, like those windows for exploiting have been narrowed, and so we can hopefully save time at least, and sort of buy the VM teams a little bit more time to kind of actually get those vulnerabilities patched and make the system secure.
Exactly.
Great. Well, I'm feeling less vulnerable as a result of speaking to both of you. So thank you very much, Harriett. Thank you very much, Jill. If anybody of you watching this would like a little bit more information, they can reach us at databee@comcast.com. So that's DATABEE@comcast.com. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.